Hi and welcome to the Journalism Salute. I'm Mark Simon. In each episode, we'll talk to or about an interesting person or organization related to journalism. The intent is to show that journalists are not the enemy of the people. Thank you for listening. On today's episode, we're joined by Jared Council. Jared is senior editor at Forbes. He covers stories that touch on Black business, Black culture, and Black power. He's a graduate of Hampton University who previously worked in Indiana and Virginia and also at the Wall Street Journal. He's based in Philadelphia. Hi, Jared.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for having me.
So we always ask to start out, what's your journalism origin story?
So my story is, there was no like kind of aha moment. I kind of stumbled into journalism, so to speak. So just to set the stage, I'm originally from outside of Philadelphia. I have 11 siblings, and I grew up like a math and science geek. Like that's where my inclination was. And yeah, there was nothing sort of in my childhood that really led me to journalism. But when I got to Hampton, I was a biology major there, and it was my second year, and I knew I didn't want to be in biology. And I called my brother, my oldest brother, his name's Rashid, and I was just like, man, I just need some advice. Like, what should I do? I don't want to be wasting my time here. And he was like, you should go over to the media school. And the background of that was he and I used to go out and film rap battles on the street, and I used to help him with I guess the camera work and editing and all of that. So, he thought that the media, would be good for me. So I get there, I had no clue what to expect, and the dean at the time of the journalism school at Hampton was Tony Brown, and he's known for having one of the longest running shows on PBS. And he took a look at some of my writing work and was like, you've got something there. We need to get you in some print journalism classes. So yeah, that's how I came into it. Again, nothing was like special. I didn't write for a high school newspaper or anything. That was my way in. And if you'll indulge me for a second, I mean, I think for me, like, when I actually knew that journalism was for me, that probably came around 2010, 2011, when I was working at the Evansville Courier and Press. And while I was there, there was an event taking place where they had, speakers, including civil rights activists, like come in and just give these keynotes. And, I was asked to cover it. And the woman who was speaking that day was Diane Nash. She was one of the co-founders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which, as you may know, helped coordinate the bus boycotts and things of that nature back in the '60s. And so I spoke to her before that speech, and when the event actually came up, she saw me in the hallway and walked up to me and was like, "That was the most accurate article that had been written about me, ever. And I just want you to know that I appreciate it." And I don't know that in that moment, I didn't really know how to process that. I mean, this is this legend in many ways, telling me about my importance as a storyteller. And I think what it showed me over time was, like, perspective matters. The power of the pen matters, and who's behind that pen matters, and what you emphasize, and the nuances in which you tell a story, the context, the cultural context that you bring to a story, all of that matters. And Jared, you have a role to play in this broader media landscape about bringing that lens, or being an example of what that looks like.
That's terrific. A story and series of anecdotes that are all kind of just in nature that kind of take you through from biology all the way to it sounding like it becoming somewhat of a calling for you. And I'm curious, about those initial stops that you had. You mentioned Evansville. I mentioned you worked in Indiana and Virginia. What were the most important things that you took away from those experiences before you got to the bigger places?
Yeah, so in Evansville, I was mostly I reported on crime, and I made my way into county government. So a lot of those stories had to deal with like budgets and finances, and how we come up with the money, or we have too much money, and what do we do with it, that sort of thing. I was able to leverage like those experiences, especially when it comes to dollars, to get into business journalism. And Virginia was my first stop in business journalism, and brand new world for me, but really exciting one. I had always, like I mentioned, I'd always kind of liked math and numbers, and just being able to like cover companies, right? And not just regular citizens. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it was another level. And, understanding like this is what they have to go through. These are the challenges that they have. These are the expectations that are placed on them, not just from their customers or their employees, but also governments, and seeing how these institutions with so much power and so much influence, so much money, how they manage all of those affairs. And so, while I was there, I was covering defense. There's a big naval, a presence there, tourism, and higher education, and really the business behind how those entities operate. So that's what I learned in Virginia. And then Indiana was a really important stop for me because it was there that I learned about the finance behind business, right? The money that's used to get it started and to fund it and to help it grow. And, while I was there, I covered tech and startups, right? I mean, what better experience to learn about all of those things. And I got there at a really interesting time. There was a company called Salesforce, which you may know, big software company, and they bought another firm there named Exact Target for about $2.5 billion. And that was in 2013. I arrived in 2014, so I was still seeing the ripple effect of that purchase. And yeah, again, I got to see firsthand, folks starting companies with newfound money. I got to see folks who used to be entrepreneurs turn into angel investors. All of those things, again, about how venture capital works and how much of a powerful wealth creation tool it is. And, I also recognize that Black and brown people were largely absent from those conversations and from that wealth creation. And, so though, yeah, in a nutshell, those two experiences were really pivotal for me, not just entering business journalism, but really understanding the main, the primary mechanics of it, and how to find good stories to tell people about it.
And a lot of your current stories are reflected in the fact that you just said that there's a lack of Black and brown people. A lot of your current stories are often giving strong attention to those people. I want to move to the Wall Street Journal, where you were for about 2.5 years. And like, I've worked at kind of like the peak of my profession, ESPN. Wall Street Journal, for a lot of people, would be peak of their profession. I'm curious how that experience shaped you as a reporter.
Yeah, I mean, that was a dream job for sure. And, forever grateful for my time there. And my experience there, I was brought in to cover artificial intelligence. Again, this is a technology that for decades has had its peaks and valleys, its hype cycles and its winners. And I was there right. I would say when the hype cycle was kind of heating up and companies were like experimenting with it, like how do we use it? What can we do? This is what we want to do. So that was another step in, again, seeing how companies operate. But at this time it was at a national level. You're dealing with pretty much publicly traded companies. The CEOs or even other C-suite officials are not as accessible as they might be at more local companies. So yeah, learned a lot, just in terms of like how to deal with them. I got more pitches than I could ever imagine. Everybody wants their startup, or has this great idea, and everybody's shooting their shot, and there's only one hoop. So just learning to deal with that. And outside of that, I just say, like, generally, I had to learn to become faster and more accurate. And like, you can't sacrifice either. Like, you have to, and in many cases, we had to like turn around daily stories, like what was the news driving that day, advancing stories for second day, takes and that sort of thing. And yeah, I mean, we're moving fast, but you can't get anything wrong. The corrections were very much frowned upon. And so, for me, it just helped me to like build these habits of fact checking while I'm on the phone, like repeating things back to sources to make sure I got it right, emailing lines that I wasn't 100% sure on, right? Even the smallest doubt, it's like double check it, and yeah, it just helped build that up for me. I realized the gravity of being at a publication like that meant that, your words and your mistakes were very, like, they were very weighty, and you really had to do your best to make sure that you got it right. So that's what I learned there.
Yep, I lived it as well. Similar, it sounds like to you, very high pressure atmosphere. One of the highlights of your time there, you did a piece for the Journal about the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, and you looked at it from the angle of insurance and how Black Tulsans were denied payouts for damage done by whites. How did you combine the history aspect of the interviews, of the history aspect of the story, with interviews of both sociologists and family members?
Yeah, well, first off, I just have to say that working on that story with the team that we had there is my proudest moment in journalism. We were able to really tell a story that some folks knew about and had been written about before, but to do it with the heft and power, and force of the Wall Street Journal, and look at it from an economic angle. The Tulsa Race Massacre, which hadn't really been taught in schools. I didn't learn about it in school, but it was, the 100th anniversary was coming up, and we wanted to put our stamp on it. So proud of that work. It was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize last year, and yeah, just I can't. I'll forever hold that time in my heart. But to your question about sort of
The mechanics of it, yeah.
yeah, and pulling together the different threads. I mean, I venture to say that there were probably 4 threads that I had to work on all at once with that story. You mentioned the people and finding the family, and that's always important to have that example whenever you're telling a story that can be as mundane, a topic as insurance. But I'd also have to throw in the data, like looking through old documents and figuring out what the actual numbers were, making sense of it, making sure that I had a command of it. And I'd throw also the history, finding people who could put some kind of context around what was going on at the time. So that was another element I had to work through. And then I'd say the corporate response, right? Reaching out to the insurance industry today for an explanation, for a comment of some sort. I think people interested in the question of, was this the right thing to do, right? These claims were denied by the insurance companies. Was it the right thing to do? That answer can change over time. And as journalists, I think we have to, answers to questions like that, we have to continually pose it to companies. I mean, there are things that companies have been involved in that were acceptable at one point in time that are no longer acceptable. And at certain points throughout history, how leaders felt about those things changed, right? I mean, one example is the practice of insuring, writing life insurance policies on enslaved people, for the benefit of the slaveholders, right? I mean, that again, we're far from that. But at some point, somebody had to say, look, this isn't right, even if it is legally okay. And so again, I just think like history is really very much living, and as journalists, we're the ones that have to pose these questions throughout history, and I think the answers can be very revealing. And so, in this case, like spoiler alert, I got a lot of non-answers, right? Just again posing this question of, what do you have to say about this? Like, how do your leaders feel about this incident that happened 100 years ago? Should it have played out differently? And by and large, the response I got from the companies that I asked was, look, we can't find any record of the claim that you're referring to. This was 100 years ago. We really can't comment, right? And that was the extent of it for the most part. Again, look, it's not my job to give a certain answer. It's just my job to ask the question. So, again, that was one component of it. I think finding a family was a very challenging aspect of this story. I was, again, the event happened, the Tulsa Massacre happened in 1921. The lawsuits that were basically suing the insurance companies for not paying the claims, that all happened over a 10 or so year period afterwards. And I read through a lot of those lawsuits and just, could kind of see the pain, could see the stories, could see what people had and what they lost and what it meant. I just knew that in order for this story to really hit home, like, we have to connect it to today. We have to connect it to someone today. Somebody who could speak on, the trauma, right, of this happening to one of their ancestors, to get their thoughts on what could have been. All of those sorts of questions, I think, can really just really bring a lot more relevance and power to a story. When you have that example of again, someone who's connected to a tragedy like this. So I was able to find actually a TV news reporter who is a descendant of Lulu Williams. She owned the Dreamland Theater and several other businesses, and really had what was kind of, what appeared to be a growing empire. I was able to talk with this family and get to hear from them about their feelings on it all. They shared original documents with me. I mean, it was again, it was hard to to track them down because there's so many. I mean, there were nearly 200 lawsuits, and it's like, where do you start? But that was again tough. And then, I mean, the final thing I'll mention is Leslie Schism. She's the insurance reporter. I'm sorry, she's an insurance reporter at the Wall Street Journal. I mean, she was so just clutch, honestly, for me, because she knew people in the industry, retired folks even, who could connect the dots between companies that exist today, the insurance companies that exist today, and those that were writing these policies that were ended up being denied back then. And I mean, that I needed that because I had a list of claims. I had, who the companies were back then, but I didn't want to go, when I was going to reach out to the insurance companies, I didn't want to go there empty-handed. I didn't want to just say, generally, how do you feel about this? I mean, there has to be some sort of connection to why you're reaching out to that specific company. And so Leslie, again, was just so vital in helping me put together that, that evidence, so to speak. But overall, like, again, this project was very challenging. A lot of 3 a.m., 4 a.m. type nights, just making sure I got everything right and making sure I had a command of all of the details. Again, very challenging, but just also very rewarding in terms of, telling this important story, in many ways not untold, but there were aspects of the Tulsa Massacre that hadn't been told. And being able to contribute, if you will, to the public record about what happened and the details and the impact, right? That's ultimately what we were trying to do there. And again, I'm proud of the work we were able to do with that.
Well, it occurs to me in thinking about it from their end that there must have been some stunned people on the other ends of lines in certain instances trying to figure out what to say to you. And I'm sure that there were more than a few instances in that of, we'll call you back.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's, I mean, you raise a good point, right? Like, again, no one today had anything to do with what happened in the 1920s. However, their names in many cases, or in some cases, the company's name didn't even change. Like, there were no mergers or anything. It was, they wrote this policy back then and they exist today. And so as it's our job as journalists to raise that point. Why? Because not only are readers curious about that, but the family was curious about it. I mean, when you feel like someone has aggrieved your ancestor and no one has answered for it, you feel hopeless and like you have no recourse, right? But when somebody, any journalist, I mean, that's just the power that we have, and I think we have to be responsible. And we're not, when we're reaching out to these companies, like we're not casting any blame, so to speak, or we're not indicting you today about what happened. But it is a question that needs to be posed. How did this happen? Why did this happen? What do you have to say about it?
It seems like there are a lot of instructive things that came from that story. I want to move on to one other aspect of that story because I made a mistake when I wrote you. I referred to it as the Tulsa Race Riot, but as you noted in the story, it's known as the Tulsa Race Massacre now, and the distinction is important. This was brought up 2 years ago. It's still pertinent today. Explain the distinction and why you included it in the story, so you can just...
Oh, for sure. Yeah, and you can go very deep in the weeds on this topic, but I'll just say in general that at the time when this massacre happened, it was referred to as a riot. And the people who referred to that, it was obviously in their best interest to do it, right? To make it seem like this was sort of a spontaneous event that both parties were responsible for, as opposed to, directed terrorism, right? That's what it actually was. And so to be honest, there weren't the people who were the power brokers back then, whether it was the sheriff or the police or the fire chief, the mayor, right? They could frame it and characterize it as that. And Black people were not in a position largely to refute that, right? It's what became public knowledge almost.
Not in 1921 you couldn't.
Yeah, right. So yeah, it was a mischaracterization from jump. And the reason why it's important that was, or that many people felt it was important to get that changed, was for that reason, right? To correct history, because Black and brown people generally are not the writers of history, but it does matter. And so, there was an effort. I think it really took hold in like the later 2010s or so, and gained steam, and then ultimately the Tulsa Race Riot Commission was renamed to the Tulsa Race Massacre Commission. And if for nothing else, it was something that, again, was a more accurate depiction of what happened. Now, I'll say this, whether it was a riot or not, or a massacre, didn't matter for the insurance policies. It didn't matter for the insurance claims, because there was language in these insurance provisions that said any riot or invasion or attack, anything of that nature, would not be covered by under this policy. And what I discovered in my reporting is that that language probably had roots in the Civil War era, where insurers were fearful about, we had just got finished a very bloody war, and that's where that came from. But by the time the 1920s hit, the only people that were disadvantaged, if you will, by that language were Black neighborhoods, right? Were these areas where these riots, as they called them at the time, but really these attacks were taking place. And so if you're an insurance company and you have language that disproportionately impacts Black people who are paying into these policies, really trying to piece together whatever policies they can. There were a number of people who couldn't even cover their entire buildings, right? So they're really scraping together money to pay for these policies, and ultimately it's not covered and they're lost because of something that they had nothing to do with, right? And it disproportionately happened to them. And at the time, the insurance companies didn't do anything. You know, that language was removed later on, but yeah, it just kind of goes to show about how even if you're not being blatantly like discriminating against someone, if you're not looking out for rules that so happen to be doing it, the effect is just the same.
We've talked a good amount about your time at the Wall Street Journal. We need to talk about your time in your current job at Forbes. You do writing and you do editing, and I'm just going to run through some recent headlines that you've had on some of the stories that you've done. Tennessee County considers using federal COVID dollars for reparations, another topic very pertinent in 2022 that references history, certainly. Commercials and digital ads are whiter than ever. This was a recent piece that you did about TV commercials and digital commercials. And then a piece on boosting Black women in physics with a new database that is designed to garner those people much more attention. You mentioned venture capital before. You co-wrote a story recently, this was a little bit further back, about how the overturning of Roe v. Wade would impact Black women. You co-wrote that. There's a lot of variety there. What kinds of stories do you like working on best?
Yeah, quite a bit of variety for sure. And I'll just say at the onset that I'm very proud and appreciative of the position that I have at Forbes. I mean, when I took this job, it was very unique. You know, there wasn't anything like it. Basically, you know, you get to focus on, like, tell stories through a Black lens, right? Black business stories that aren't just about necessarily entrepreneurship, but you can speak about wealth and power and cultural trends that impact business as well. So yeah, you know, thank you for that, for running through some of the work that I've had. I mean, I think in many ways, like, I think the common, at least one of the themes for me in terms of like what the stories that I'm most interested in, for me, it's really just being about chronicling our culture, right? Our contributions in many ways, the trends that are important to us, the issues that impact our lives, such as the connection between hair relaxer that Black women use and cancer, right? So these kinds of stories, part of it for me is about like documenting, right? Like, I did a story on Black brunch over the summer, and you know, it's one of those things that has a special place in the hearts of many Black people, but isn't often written about, right? So I kind of took a business angle with that there. And, you know, we as a people, we've had a lot taken from us, and a lot, I guess, that's been used without credit. And then people will just say, oh, you know, it's pop culture, but it's like, no, but it came from Black culture. And so part of my job is to like find these stories that have a business angle, right? We're a business publication, but also to, again, document our contributions, document, you know, show a perspective about something that may not really be seen in many of the mainstream stories. So that's what I want to bring to the table.
One of the recent pieces that you did was a story that again goes back and looks at history. And in this case, it was Amalia Curse. She was a bipartisan shortlist pick of a number of presidents regarding being appointed to the United States Supreme Court as the first Black woman before Ketanji Brown Jackson. I'm curious if you can walk us through that story from original idea to finished product.
Yeah, for sure, Matt. You know, that is another story that I'm proud of, because it elevated or maybe put a spotlight on something that a lot of people probably didn't know about, right? Like I want to, that's another aspect of the job that I like, is revealing things that you may not have known. And so when I came across her story, we were looking for, this was right before Judge Jackson was appointed, or at least in that time frame, and we were trying to. I'm sorry, no, she'd already been appointed, but just not actually, seat in front. Yeah, and so we were just trying to find a different way to tell that story. I mean, you're gonna have, this is historical, this is important. There've been 100 or plus white justices up until recent years. Like, all those stories are important, but we just wanted a different take that stood out. And I came across this book about women who shortlisted. In fact, I think that was the name of the book, Shortlisted. And I was just curious, like, were there any black women in that list? And it turns out there was. And what I think is fascinating about her story, and I talked to one of her family members afterwards, and they were obviously happy about Judge Jackson, but sad that their family member didn't get the chance and had been overlooked, so to speak. But what was fascinating to me about the story is that, and I use the word fascinating, it doesn't feel like the right word, because there is a bit of like a wow, like that's a shame, but it was like, she had 4 opportunities by presidents of both parties. So it started with Reagan. Reagan had her on his short list twice. And I'm sorry, Jimmy Carter appointed her to federal judgeship. She was on Reagan's short list. He was Republican. She was on George H.W. Bush's short list. He was a Republican. And then President Clinton, a Democrat, also considered her. And so she was widely considered to be, I believe, conservative leaning, but still kind of middle of the road. And, despite all of that, it just, she was highly qualified, had wrote some really important decisions even before, some of those considerations for her. And it didn't matter, right? And like, I can't go back in history and figure out what played into why, the presidents chose who they did. But I think for many Black people in particular, you look at a story like that and you say, dang, America proven time and time again who it prefers and the order of those operations, right? And so I just felt it was important to highlight her story and to, again, just let it be known for people who didn't know.
Bringing history back, as you've done in a number of pieces that I was going through, both at the Journal and at Forbes.
I'm like a history reporter. I mean, those are.
Well, no, it's a niche that's important, and again, instructive to someone that aspires to do what you do. That being a history reporter matters, and that it's important in the grand scheme of things. You got to know your history. How has being a journalist shaped how you view the world?
Oh man, being a journalist, it is a lifestyle, and it's a lifestyle that it's hard to imagine how I would go about life if I didn't know what I learned from journalism. Not only have I basically gotten free business school with some of the publications that I've worked at, but just being in journalism in general exposes you to so many different things, so many different aspects of society that are important, but that are often like not in our frame of view. And, I think for me, it's just made me realize that you can always press harder, right? Like you don't have to take no for an answer, and you can tell like who's saying no and how much power they have too.
You mentioned to me in an earlier conversation that you very much want to move the industry forward for Black men and women. What are the experiences that you've had that you want to teach others to handle?
I appreciate this question, and it's one of those things where I think I grew up and I came up through the ranks of journalism, like hearing about discrimination, blatant racism, not just within the newsroom, microaggressions, of course, but also outside of the newsroom too. As I went through journalism, you think, oh, well, like, man, I don't have any horror stories, right? Like, that's not that type of stuff that happened decades ago is not happening now. Like, is everything fine and is it okay? And you realize that no, it's not. We're still far from where we need to be. We're still largely not decision makers in a lot of newsrooms. And there's so many implications of that, from what stories get told to how they get told to how they're framed to who gets hired. And I think that there's so much more to do on that front. And for me personally, I think one of the things, like the experiences that I've had just kind of learning journalism and learning this world, I think I mentioned to you, I'm one of 12 siblings. Like, I don't come from money. And when I first like got into journalism, you realize how much of a middle and upper class industry this is, right? And there's a language that comes with that I didn't know how to speak, right? Whether it's being in meetings, whether it's trying to build camaraderie with people, these are all kind of like new things to me. And so yeah, I mean, those are like experiences, and those are just my general thoughts on my obstacles, or like what we face as journalists today. You still have, in many cases, and I hear about this from people in my network, but like folks undermining you or not taking your ideas seriously. There's still so many struggles, and I think having more diverse leaders in media is, it may not be a panacea, but it's definitely something that can help turn that tide. Like, we still do have, much work to do there. Your question though was about advice to students, and so I guess with that backdrop, I would say, like, keep going. First off, this is a tough industry, whether it's late nights or really struggling with how to get a story over the hump. I mean, it's rigorous, and it'll kick you behind some days. But for me, I think what's kept me going is, like, you have to, like, you're somebody's voice, right? You're bringing a perspective that isn't common, and like somebody's relying on you. Somebody's looking for you to speak for them. Someone is, needs you to tell their stories and speak to them in the work that you do. And so, and then somebody out there, it needs an example, right? Like I don't know who I've impacted yet, but I know that, I have relationships with a lot of young journalists, and, I just think about, like, man, what if I wasn't in my role? What if I wasn't doing what I'm doing? Like, could that have made them decide to leave, or, you know what I mean? So that's what keeps me going. And the other thing too is, like, it's real cliche, but it almost can't be cliche because it's so important. But the networking thing, you hear it time and time again. Not what you know, who you know. Pretty much all of my jobs have come from knowing somebody either there or with a connection to that job, right? Like them vouching for me or putting in a good word for me. It's so crucial. And in the pandemic era that we live in, work from home and all of that, it is harder to network. But I would say every time that you have opportunities to do it, like, bend over backwards to make it happen, because you never know who you're going to meet. You never know. And it's almost, in many ways, it's kind of like watering a plant too, right? Like, especially if you're going to an event with people that you already know, that you haven't seen in a while, like, those things are important. And I'm sorry, I know we're short on time, but I just have to say also, take the job. Like, it's good for journalists to kind of cut their teeth, especially, when you're young, get the experience at a place, really learn how it works, really try to perform and do your best while you're there. So,
all right, last question. We salute you for your good work and ask that you do likewise. Is there a Black journalist that you would like to salute for their good work?
Yeah, this one, there's a lot of folks that come to mind for me that I think do tremendous work. Just to name a few, Justin Tinsley and Anscape, Jordan Holman at the New York Times. She covers retail there, and there are a few others. Dominic Midori. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank, but she covers VC, venture capital and startups at Davis is her last name. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, she covers VC at TechCrunch and is a very passionate writer. Like you can almost feel her conviction through her stories, and she speaks to you, not at you. And yeah, those are just a few that come to mind. But there's so many great journalists out there of all shades. I mean, I love I love this profession. It's a very small one, but you know, you got people that are really doing big and amazing things. Oh, one other person I'll mention too, Richard Prince has a website called Journalism. You're nodding your head, so yeah,
Yep, I'm familiar with it.
you know, it's just a fascinating. I mean, he used to be a Washington Post reporter, and I'm sure had a very, you know, he's been around the block, but the way he delivers news that you care about the media industry, and from just again a lens of diversity, right? One where it's like if this is important to you, here are the stories that touch on that and that matter most in that area. And I mean, he does a phenomenal job. It's a must read for me. So
Sure. Jared Council, you're certainly on our list. We thank you for taking the time to join us. Best of luck. We'll be following you throughout your career.
all right, appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Journalism Salute. Please let us know what you think of the show. You can find us on Twitter at JournalismPod, and you can email us at journalismsalute@gmail.com.